Hey everybody, Daniel from Spacedock here. Now, right now, I should probably be doing some kind of more professional work and writing an episode or something like that, but in the interest of procrastination, I'm going to go on a bit of a tirade about the Mitchell Hyundai Starfury Aurora from Babylon 5, and why I think it's pretty much the perfect sci-fi fighter design. Now, this gorgeous 3D model is from a gentleman named Remy on Sketchfab that I stumbled across, and it gives me a perfect opportunity to talk about this in detail and point out some awesome features of its design. Basically, the main thing I'm trying to say here is that the Starfury Aurora is the end result of trying to apply realism to a space fighter. Now, a space fighter is an inherently unrealistic idea, especially a manned space fighter that isn't operated by some kind of computer. Generally speaking, in space, if you're talking about interplanetary travel or long-distance travel, you normally want something larger simply because they require things like fuel tanks and various other onboard storage necessities for long-time travel. Obviously, the magic technology of Babylon 5 and most other sci-fi allows those kind of thrusters and such to be limited into very small amounts of space, at which point the thrust to mass ratio can be considered differently, and you can come up with something smaller like this. Maneuverability is less advantageous in a realistic space fight than something like Babylon 5 would have you believe, because of course realistic space combat takes place over much greater ranges, or would take place over much greater ranges, though that's not especially cinematic. Babylon 5 strikes a pretty good balance, especially since it's one of the earliest franchises to really adopt any kind of realism in its depiction of space combat. Now, obviously the most important thing about B5 space combat is that it has a realistic flight model, unlike something like Star Wars or Stargate. The fighters obey Newton's first law, and they kind of operate in 3 dimensions, and they have to arrest their momentum as they build it. They don't have their engines burning at all times like an X-Wing does, and this kind of understanding of Newtonian physics results in the design of the Starfury Aurora, a ship that's engines are set up in such a way as to arrest its momentum in all directions and control its position in space in 360 degrees. This ship can brake as quickly as it can accelerate, it can strafe very quickly in any direction, and it can fully rotate to bring its guns to bear without changing its trajectory after it's accelerated. This is much like a Viper from Battlestar Galactica, but the Starfury is designed in a better way to take advantage of this. The ship's long arms provide as much leverage as you could possibly ask for to flip this ship end to end in less than a second, and to give it the kind of reaction times it needs to deal with fighters pursuing it. The chin-mounted guns are narrowly fixed so that they can track targets and lead targets quite easily without the risk of targets passing through the space between them, which would necessitate some kind of gimbling, as I've talked about before. The ship has the 2 chin guns that we see most often used, and some smaller, I believe heavier guns on either side of the cockpit. The cockpit is placed almost exactly at the center of mass, and the pilot stands in the cockpit, which results in minimum possible G-force on the pilot as the ship rotates, unlike this ship's successor, the Starfury Thunderbolt, which has the cockpit forward a little bit so that when it pitches up and down, the pilot is exposed to a little bit more G-force from the leverage. This is talked about in the fiction for Babylon 5, which I appreciate. They talk about how Centauri Sentry pilots will sometimes put their ships on autopilot and allow themselves to black out so that they can get into better positions at the end of it. I like it when that kind of stuff is considered in sci-fi dogfighting. The whole concept of sci-fi dogfighting, as unrealistic as it is, offers some interesting opportunities for world building and character drama, especially when you attempt in vain to apply interesting realism concepts to it, as was done here. As we can have a look at this here, we can see the ship's fusion reactor in the center. One thing I really appreciate is how fragile this ship is, as of course it would be. There's an episode in the 2nd season where a pilot gets his reactor hit and just immediately gets a lethal dose of radiation and just about manages to fly back to Babylon 5 before dying of radiation poisoning, because this is basically just a cockpit and a reactor right next to each other. It's much like how Spitfire pilots in the Second World War would have to deal with the fact that their engine and fuel tank was essentially like 10 centimeters away from where they were sat, and there was a good possibility that it would spit burning oil into their cockpit at any moment, which is a pretty horrific thing to happen, but that's what happens when you compartmentalize something down all the way to this incredibly small size. The Starfury is accessed through, I believe, a dorsal hatch, which is almost invisible on the actual model, because it's very tightly sealed down and only really opened up when the ship is in dock. The ship is held on a large retractable arm inside the Cobra bays of Babylon 5, which rather interestingly use the centrifugal gravity of B5 itself to accelerate the fighter out of the hull and give it a little bit of speed. It was actually originally intended by the VFX teams on B5 to make this the case with the Omega-class destroyers, so the ship would be spat out of the centrifuge ring in the same way it is on B5. They changed this for VFX reasons to simplify it, and they made it so the Omega's retrieval bay is also its launch bay. One thing I really appreciate about the Starfury Aurora is that it is definitely not designed to fly in atmosphere, and this is very much incorporated into its lore in the story. We hear that they can't fly in atmosphere, and then we see situations where the fact that they can't fly in atmosphere is a problem. For instance, in the Season 1 episode, I believe, A Voice in the Wilderness, where a civilian atmospheric shuttle flies too low and its escort fighters can't follow it, which puts it at risk from attack from ground fire. Really interesting. It creates more interesting things to do with the story, and it also adds a little bit of realism to this, because making something fly in atmosphere, it's not just this ancillary thing that you just have by default, or it's not something that you can easily incorporate. It requires pretty much the entire frame to be designed with aerodynamics in mind, and obviously the show gives us the Starfury Thunderbolt as an example of what happens when you try to make a Starfury atmospheric capable, and it's very well done. The Thunderbolt is a gorgeous fighter, but as I mentioned earlier, the fact that the G-forces affect the pilot more because it's been set off, there are things you can't do when you have to build your ship to work in atmosphere, and you can't have something quite as simple as this cockpit with the 4 struts and the large engine modules, because this would fall like a brick in the atmosphere. And, you know, I appreciate that they took that into account, because there are so many things in science fiction that we're meant to believe can fly in atmosphere simply because they have tiny aileron fins somewhere on them and are otherwise just house bricks. And that's extremely hard to believe. That is when you're not dealing with Star Wars and stuff where they have, like, magical repulsor lift technology. If we look closely here, we can see some of the little hard points for missiles. I don't know if we see Starfuries firing missiles in any episode of the show. The fantastic free space conversion, the Babylon project, shows Starfuries in the first the Earth Minbari War, sorry, using missiles, which I think is very cool. The term Starfury Aurora comes from the roleplay books, the Babylon 5 role-playing board game books, because we only hear of them called Starfuries in the show, and their successors referred to as Thunderbolts. But the ancillary material from those role-playing books gives us a little bit more context. The Starfury is the second iteration, or the Aurora is the second iteration of the Starfury, and the Thunderbolt is the third, with the original Starfury being called the Nova, and it was apparently used in the Dilgar War. There are various fan art interpretations of the Nova Starfury, and also another one called the Starfury Tiger. Neither of those have canon visual appearances. There's also a sort of spin-off model of the Starfury called the Badger, which is referred to a few times. I don't know if that has a canon visual design, but there are certainly some fan ones where it's essentially bulked out a little bit and has a kind of thicker hull section in the center. There's also a heavy Starfury that we see in Voice in the Wilderness in Season 1 that has a tailgun turret. This was, I believe, invented by the VFX department at the last minute because they realized they needed a way to get the captain of the Hyperion over to the Babylon 5 station, and the Hyperion didn't have any shuttles, so they had to make up this particular Starfury could carry a second person because it had a gun turret. We never see those again, and we never find out if they have any more of a technical name than Heavy Starfury. The Aurora has a completely detachable cockpit as an escape pod rather than a separate ejection seat. This makes a lot of sense. It provides the pilot with a little bit more safety and security, and probably the same life support supply that he was using when he was in there, which is a very sensible decision. This ship really just has an incredible amount of elegance on screen. It really does dance through these space battles. Its presence is just fantastic, and the whole kind of sharp and quick rotations and quick stops that it makes as it turns, they look sort of robotic and janky, but it makes perfect sense. This is the way something behaves in a vacuum. It doesn't bank into turns like an X-Wing does, as an X-Wing is designed by the VFX teams to kind of mimic the actions of a World War II fighter and sort of that whole Pacific War angle that Star Wars bases almost all of its combat off. This was a very bold move to make in 1998 or whatever with Babylon 5, to just sort of fully embrace the realistic, fully Newtonian flight model for space fighters, because it was something that people in mainstream sci-fi watching it would never have seen before, not really. Only people reading into sci-fi literature and going a little bit deeper would have ever imagined what space combat could look like with these tenets of realism applied to it, and it was sharply brought into the mainstream by Babylon 5, and I really respect them for doing that. As much as B5's Amiga graphics were incredibly far ahead of their time back in the day, it is a great shame that we've never seen the Starfury in action in modern CG, with the exception of its brief appearance in Babylon 5 The Lost Tales, which had some really gorgeous graphics in 2008, I believe. But if there's any justification for a modern Babylon 5 remaster or reboot, it's just that it would be so cool to see these things again in modern technology on screen. Because I'd take a Starfury over an X-Wing any day. These things really are just perfect, elegant designs, and they're proof that you can delineate down all of the problems of designing a spacecraft, all of the scientific boundaries, try to create something completely realistic, and still end up with something incredibly cool looking. This is probably the best balance of realism and the aesthetic rule of cool that's ever been struck by a sci-fi fighter, and it deserves a hell of a lot of respect for that. Fantastic little piece of heritage sci-fi spaceship design, and from a series that contributed so much to the sci-fi genre, this really is one of the best little additions mixed in there. This is Daniel from Spacedock, signing off. Thank you for watching Spacedock. If you're interested in supporting the channel, please do check out the links on the screen right now or in the description below for our Patreon and channel membership services. Anything you can pledge goes towards improving our team and our equipment and allowing us to put together bigger and more exciting video projects for you guys on the channel.